So what is the inner child? So your inner child is a part of you that's formed in the childhood and lives with you or inside of you today. And one of the main things that understand that it holds your most, the earliest emotions, needs, beliefs, memories, and ways of relating to to the world and to one another. Most important things to understand that the patterns that you learned as a child get inbuilt up or become part of your patterns as a child, as an adult when you move on to adulthood. So that's one of the things that you will see is that some of the things that we're not sure why we do certain behaviors, certain actions that sometimes we still maybe bringing from our parents are coming from our inner child. So it is something to understand. It is actually an aspect of our mind because understanding the subconscious mind will really help you understand how your inner child works. And you will see that our inner child especially defines a lot of the habits we have when we're going through stress, anxiety, when things don't really go our way. So it's important to understand the relationship between our subconscious mind, especially, and the inner child. So the inner child essentially can be understood as one aspect of the subconscious mind. So it is essentially, you can be seen as a symbolic representation, but it's a real aspect of yourself, right? So your subconscious mind is also responsible for all the emotional learning, early experiences, thinking and belief patterns, essentially, traumatic reactions, how especially if you have developed certain habits that it gets stored in your subconscious mind, and beliefs about your safety, love, worth, and then what to live, right? So there's a lot of things that gets associated or become part of the subconscious mind. The key to understand is that your inner self or inner child is actually part of this subconscious mind because it holds that information that you learned when you were maybe the child or teenager. Sometimes it can be included even young adulthood. It can be considered part of the inner childhood experience, right? But there's a lot of, essentially the key thing to understand is that there's a lot of emotions, memories, habits that are either painful, sometimes positive, sometimes playful. Memories are associated with this aspect of the mind. So now you'll be wondering what actually wounds the inner child. So there are specific things that can actually happen when we were children that can affect our experiences as children, and then those experiences affecting our adult experiences. So one of the main things to understand, because our conscious mind is not fully developed, we go through essentially a lot of challenging experiences as children. Either it's through emotional neglect, or somebody is not validating or accepting our emotions, or it could be inconsistent love or affection or attention from a parent or from a loved one. And also things like high expectations without emotional support can also affect that. So if you're coming from sometimes immigrant families, right, and you tend to be affected by very high expectations of yourself sometimes, and then that can affect your inner child, right? And also things like being ashamed or ashamed for having emotional needs, just the needs overall can affect the inner child as well. And also sometimes you needing to grow up. Sometimes when you have to become responsible for your life, responsible for other people's life too early, it can also affect on how whether you develop inner wounds or not. And one of the biggest one, we'll talk a little bit about this more extensively, criticism and blame. When you're going through a certain amount of criticism when you're as a child, what happens is that this inner criticism tend to appear when you're an adult as well, right? So it comes as harsh inner voice, inner critic. So something that you want to, what we'll focus on, in terms of the tools in order for you to help you deal with it, is that calming this inner voice, inner critic is one of the most effective ways to heal the inner child in the long run. So even many people who have good childhoods can carry a lot of wounds, and the wounds can happen in young adulthood as well. So you're not. This is one of the main things. Many people think many people go through childhood issues that they're alone. But the key thing to remember is that many people actually go through it, and you're not alone. And a lot of people who come to my help for anxiety and depression and different type of issues have challenges they have gone through as a younger people. What are some of the symptoms of a wounded inner child? Because you will see that the reason why I wanted to bring out this slide is because many people sometimes don't know how they are affected by having wounds even when they're children. Sometimes it can manifest as anxiety. It can manifest as being very sensitive to triggers, being triggered very quickly by hurt, by painful experiences. So there's many ways that being in having an inner child can affect you. So one of the biggest one I've seen in my research, especially when I'm helping people, is that overreaction to criticism and authority is a big one. So even small feedback feels deeply personal and threatening, and the body essentially react with fear, shame, or defensiveness even sometimes, right? So even when the mind knows that it is actually safe, but there's a certain level of overreaction associated with when it comes to criticism. So when you're getting triggered by criticism, that's a sign. So that's one of the key things that will tell you whether you're affected, you have an inner child who needs help. Another important thing you want to remember is that if you have internally, you have a lot of self-criticism and inner harshness going on, this is another time to pay attention to it, because usually people, when you have gone through, when you have a wounded inner child aspect, you tend to have perfectionism. You tend to criticize yourself a lot for the mistakes you make in the past, right? So there's a certain level of inner harshness associated with that. And this inner heart tends to be demanding and then shaming and then tend to be unforgiving, right? So this is often mirrors usually how love or approval was conditioned in the childhood. So usually this voice is a representation of one of the voices that you probably heard when you were a child. Also, the another aspect of it that is important to understand, that when you have a wounded child aspect of you, you also tend to be people pleasing and fears disappointing others. So, and also it feels like when you're saying no to others feels unsafe, right? So you will see that these things are usually people pleasing behavior, fear of disappointing others, usually have a tendency to being having criticism when you're a child. And then that's why you'll see when we're talking about in our third step, how to actually reparent yourself or reparent your subconscious mind or yourself, so that you become the right parent for you, or the kind parent for you that you needed. So the important thing to understand is that there's people pleasing behavior, fear of disappointing others, and also there's emotional dysregulation, or known as sudden shutdown, right? Strong emotions appear quickly, and although the person becomes numb or freezes or dissociates especially when they're stressed, right? So you will see that there's this pattern in our inner child aspects of it tend to come repeatedly when we experience a lot of stress and a lot of traumatic kind of experiences, right? So triggers are usually the signs of things that we know that this is stressing. And then once you started to see them, you would see these are some of this, the way you respond to these issues is essentially how you learn to respond in the past when you're younger, right? So it's just now coming up. What we need to do in terms of learning how to deal with them is essentially retrain our nervous system and our ability to think, to make better decisions and more useful decisions over time, which we will talk about more as we're going through these sessions. And also you'll see that especially when you have inner child issues, you have a tendency to, difficulty actually trusting others, trusting even being successful, or even being peace. You feel like it will be taken away from you. So there's this aspect of even when things are calm or going well, the nervous system stays on alert. You have this usually anxiety become a predominant thing later in life if a wounded child aspect is experienced. So usually with anxiety, there's aspect of this avoidance, procrastination, and self-sabotage associated with that as well. So that's something to pay attention to, see if there are, if you recognize these patterns now within yourself. And again, these are fixable issues, is that sometimes they get built up into our subconscious mind from our past when we were children. So you'll see the task, especially linked to things like evaluation or exposure or evaluation. So that means in school or even work, right, can tend to trigger these experiences, even at home as well. But usually when you're being evaluated, they tend to get triggered, right? So even sometimes just like calmness can be uncomfortable. Even support and love and compassion can be uncomfortable for people who have had the inner wounded inner child, right? So that's something to keep an eye on. If you feel like, because I used to, when I was younger, when I was growing up, I didn't feel comfortable even like getting hugs or anything like that. So over the years is when I learned about these aspects, that especially these aspects that when I was child, how I was affected. I really didn't know how. But again, the key thing to remember is it's a normal, many human beings, as all of us go through it. But now psychotherapy and counseling have come to a point that people can be helped through these things. So even you will see some of the practices we'll be talking about here, you will see that they immediately can be very effective, especially aspect of self-compassion. So we'll talk about them bit by bit.
Could you expand more on eight, this difficulty receiving care and compassion? Where does that stem from in early childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens when when we are children, sometimes some of us have parents who continually love us and consistent, but sometimes some of us have parents who can be inconsistent. Sometimes they are not there at all. Sometimes they might have emotional issues on their own, so they are in their emotional expressions. So what we started to do is not rely necessarily on compassion and love and receiving care from others. We started to strap our own boots and started to take care of ourselves more. So now what happens is that we are becoming less trusting of others' love because from a young age we had to start to essentially take care of ourselves the best way we knew, even though that would have been a very painful experience. So now we have a hard time relinquishing that self-reliance and then taking and accepting somebody else's love, compassion now.
Sorry, could you also speak a little bit more about the adaptive side of some of these behaviors that are listed here? Personally, for myself, I find that yes, that is a problem in some areas, but in others, it's really been the thing that has helped me excel as much and helped me get over some of the trauma that I had faced and not lean into that mindset of woe is me. So, how would you advise us on finding that balance of the adaptation versus the maladaptation side of these things?
Absolutely. So I think this is something I actually questioned even when I was actually beginning my own journey, is that you see that there's these maladaptation aspects was initially adaptive aspects. You see that sometimes as we grow through our ages, right, as we becoming adults and then increase in our age, you see that some of these aspects are no longer useful. But earlier in our life, not necessarily trusting people right away might have been useful to you. But as we get older, once as we started to develop our conscious mind, we can now start to picking and choosing to the level in which as the aspects that are maladaptive and adaptive, which is a great question you ask, because again it depends on because sometimes if I ask you to tell you to right away, hey, stop overreacting to things, if overreaction is still necessary for you in order to deal with the specific challenging situations in life, you might be reacting to the fact that I'm telling you to stop overreacting. So sometimes certain things are adaptive, that you will see that certain things are still adaptive to you, even though it's maladaptive on the long run. But observing, that's why starting to becoming more conscious of what is happening because of your childhood experiences is actually one of the most important and most valuable steps for now. Then over time, you will say, okay, this is no longer useful. What do I have to do to now let go of this belief system or resulting habits that are associated with that?
Or use it strategically as the context demands, correct?
Precisely. You got it 100%. So that's a great question, by the way. So let me see.
And I have a quick question on the third point, though, regarding the people pleasing.
Sure.
First of all, I could relate to all the points that you mentioned, but this is the most weakest point in my life so far. The thing
Okay.
is, the people pleasing. Most of the times, I tend to say a yes for all, and I never say no to anything.
Right.
And when I try to overcome myself, what happens is the other people, whoever listening to me, feel like rude or arrogant, saying that like, you're kind of arrogant, dude. You're saying no.
Right.
How is it different to others when it compares to me?
Yeah.
And this is really affecting me when I'm being a software developer. working in a corporate sector.
Interesting. Wow, that is a tough situation. To be honest, I was in a similar situation myself, my friend. So it is something that is pleasing, people pleasing, and fear of disappointing is a big one that actually shows up as a bit. It is something that obviously we can talk a little bit more about it, but it is one of those hard, challenging ones aspects of it, and it is actually coming from the place. Hey, there are things that if you don't, because the love was hard to find, right? Essentially, for a wounded child, they will please people extensively in order to make sure that things are smooth and they're conflict free, right? But that just recognizing a lot of the time is that you can be people pleasing, and then seeing that, hey, at the end of the day, that you matter as well. You're actually trying to live and be happy, and the people pleasing might not be always serve you in the long run, because people can take advantage of you. I think that's the biggest issue with people pleasing behavior, is that people take an advantage. So that affects usually your mental health and the physical health, right? So recognizing that is that one of the biggest things. But I think the solution for it is systematically setting boundaries, which was one of the hardest things for me to personally do. But it is something I had to learn over time. When you want to get along with people, be good to people, to be honest.
A follow-up question on that. If at all I gonna ask you for a suggestion, what would you suggest? What would be the measures to overcome that?
To be honest, the thing is, the setting boundaries aspect is the one of the, because once you first aspect is this, right? So if you don't find people pleasing to be serving you, it's no longer, to a certain extent, right? It can help you smooth out relationships, keep it conflict free. Then it comes to a point that you are getting regretful or resentful towards, because of your own people pleasing behaviors, right? Now you come to a, hey, this is too much, I'm getting affected. It is essentially, once you made that decision, this is too much, is to start setting some boundaries to best of your ability. Say, hey, this is the situation I have, this right now, this is not possible for me. So I would say setting boundaries would be the most ideal aspect of it, because the initial thing is, most people who engage in this behavior, they don't even know they are people pleasing. And then once you learn, you can be people pleasing or fear of disappointing others. In fact, it's actually, the thing to do is expose yourself to let go of that anxiety, which is essentially setting boundaries and then keeping in touch with people and still working with people. But it's just important, because for me, even setting boundaries was one of the biggest challenges that I experienced. But it is something, in order to protect yourself, that is very necessary, especially if you have a wounded child experiences that you have experienced in the past, right? So the best advice and guidance I can give you is think more strongly about setting boundaries, things that gives you energy, rather than things that takes your energy from you. Perfect. So there's the relationship with you will see that a lot of the challenges I've noticed when I'm working with clients is that they internalize a lot of the challenges that they're going through, with its anxiety, people pleasing behavior, things, that symptoms we saw, right? Avoidance, procrastination, fear of abandonment. What they have seen is that they internalize, they make it like, oh, there's something wrong with me. There's a lot of people who internalize there's something wrong with them. And then what that does is that it unnecessarily put a lot of pressure, right? And what you need to understand is that a lot of these inner wound aspects are coming from your subconscious, which is have been programmed when you are not even aware too much about your childhood, right? So instead of internalizing it or making or blaming yourself for these things, is the key thing is to take responsibility. Hey, I know I have this issue, but let me see what I can do about it, right? But there are ways to do it, to deal with it. But that's one of the things, the hardest part about giving recommendations right away, even these sessions, is we need to understand the full picture of it a little bit more, right? You will see once when you understand, how they're affected by their childhood, how they even their thinking process, you can really say, these are some of the challenges you might be having and blocking you. And then let's see what we have to do to unblock your certain thinking patterns or certain habits or certain patterns in the subconscious mind, right? So understanding that there's a lot of importance of understanding subconscious mind is very important, because you'll see a lot of the issues and challenges and the habits and the emotions are coming from, because that is the holding place for these things. And even you will see the repetitive thinking, right, and looping, right, or overthinking coming from the subconscious mind. And that's important to understand, right? And you'll see that when we were younger, right, when we were children, we are highly influenced by our family, our teachers, society, and then social media, right? And it's because you'll see that our conscious minds have not been fully developed yet for us to filter out what is good for us and what is not good for us. So that's why, as we talked about a little bit before, is that as you're becoming more older, your conscious mind develops as you go through sessions like this. When you started to pay attention to your mind more, you start to take more courses, you're becoming more aware. Now you can start to filter out things that are not helping you, things that ideas or belief systems or habits or even emotions that is no longer who you want to be, who's representing you. So that's essentially the key thing to understand in this slide, is that don't put personal blame on you. And also important to understand, because when we're talking about the childhood aspects, usually our mind or attention sometimes goes on to blaming our parents. This is also not useful, or blaming parents, society, or world, because our parents also probably had the same issues happen to them when they were children. They probably got criticized or blamed or in difficult situations, right? So they in together, these can have an effect in throughout our generation. So blaming is usually doesn't really work, because you will see that even blaming actually can increase anxiety if you don't watch it. So we'll talk more about that. But the understanding is, don't necessarily blame society, parents, or teachers, because sometimes they don't know also what they're doing, and they're doing what they got, or they probably even been in a more situation worse than we are. Right? Again, it doesn't condone any wrongdoing, definitely, but it understands that there are difficulties coming from other people. And let's see, so that's very important to understand. Let me see. So there's also this important aspect to understand, something known as the amygdala hijacking. I only dedicated about one slide for this. This is something I want you to research on your own time through Google or ChatGPT or whichever. But it is something that usually a lot of people go through when they get triggered by some of the things that happened in their past. So it is known as actually amygdala hijacking. So what happens is that you probably have your nervous system have essentially two systems, right? One of them is parasympathetic and the other one is sympathetic, right? So when you're during a stressful period, what happens, it actually activates a sympathetic nervous system, which is essentially also responsible for your body's fear center, right? So your response to fear, right? So when you have wounds in the past that is coming from the past when you're a child, these wounds can get triggered. Usually they tend to do with rejection, judgment, fear of loss, and let's see. So I see fear of loss, so things like that. So I see, yes, Paul, go ahead.
So what happens if this amygdala hijacking is happening constantly? You're just sitting down watching TV and you're experiencing all of that.
You'll talk about it. You'll see that there's multiple things that we need to essentially start thinking about doing. One of them is calming down your nervous system, because one of the things that happen is that if you have been in a situation that the amygdala hijacking had been normalized in your nervous system, it needs time to now calm it down a longer periods of time, which we will talk about as well. What are the specific things you can do? So again, it's to do with the nervous system. So you'll see even cardio, going into sauna. Again, there are multi levels to this. I'm just talking about strictly from the physical nervous system level. At that level, the idea is essentially to calm it down through sauna, through meditation. There's a lot. There's qigong, there's yoga can work. So at the physical level, your nervous system started to calm down. You will see that this aspect when you get a massage, even when you go to a sauna, right? And then also the cardio can really help to calm down the nervous system in the long run. Again, if it's been happening too rapidly for too long, it just needs more of an intensive relaxation process, essentially. So you will see that this amygdala hijacking also affects how you think, right? Obviously, this happened during stressful periods or somewhat stressful periods, right? So it can also affect you whether you think negatively or positively about things. So that's another thing. So usually when I remember when I was younger, somewhat older actually, in my 20s, when something doesn't go my way, I started to realize I'm starting to criticize, oh, what's wrong with me? Why am I making these mistakes? I realized is that when the amygdala hijacking happens, it can affect the way you think about things. You can end up blaming yourself, blaming others, and doing and saying things you don't mean. And usually, again, it is part of the triggering that happened. And then over time, what you have to do is, once you start to calm down your nervous system, you started to reframing some of the things that is causing you those triggers, right? Usually it's to do with self-criticism or criticism of others, because a lot of people, which we'll talk about, don't know that criticism, especially judgment or criticism, can increase your high blood pressure and then put you in a sympathetic state or amygdala hijacked state. So something to think about. So do a little bit of research on your own if you can, the effects of criticism on its own, and see what you find. It's important to understand, but you'll see that self-compassion, actually we'll talk about as one of the tools, goes a long way. So you'll see that these amygdala hijacking, even in performance-related anxiety, they're all interrelated, right? They have similar mechanisms. So once you learn to fix one of them, all the other ones also start to calm down. But the goal is to calm down these systems, including the speed of your mind, in which it processes the information, and then also the nervous system. Then you can be the one who actually controls and direct these things. So it's important to understand that. I'll say the important thing also to keep an eye on is that amygdala hijacking can happen when you're watching just like TV, even watching news. Because the news tend to increase the level of heart, blood pressure and everything. So that's a long conversation, how news does that, but keep yourself watching out yourself when you watch news, because it can increase your heart, blood pressure and amygdala hijacking. Keep an eye out for that. Perfect. So what we'll do is, like, now we'll focus on what is the true note looks like, or what is the ideal state looks like, right? So what is healing? So you'll see that when you started to heal your inner child, you tend to heal a whole bunch of other issues and challenges that you're probably experiencing as well, especially if they're related to things like anxiety, sadness, and things like that as well, because a lot of the maladaptive patterns came from our childhood and then became manifested in our adulthood, right? So what is the inner child needs, right? So inner child essentially doesn't need to be fixed. It's essentially something that needs to be essentially understood and understand. And then you'll see that one of the main things it is essentially asking for is safety. Safety, essentially feeling emotionally secure, not feeling judged, not feeling rushed. I think especially judgment. Feeling judged is the big one, right? Especially if you're feeling judged by bosses or teachers, right? It can really affect the healing process, right? So at least you can put the value of needing to create that for yourself. It becomes the ideal step, right? That you're not judging yourself, you're not criticizing yourself, you're not rushing yourself anymore. Recognizing that is no longer serving you, because a lot of the times that we sometimes used to criticize ourselves or rush because we think it would be more, it's going to be useful for us, it's going to be valuable for us, and as it did in the past. And if it doesn't, we have to essentially start taking next steps. Also, this aspect of also validation as well, acknowledging emotional reality without shame. But the thing is, you will see that being able to express your emotion and how you feel is important, because you will see that your emotions are your internal messengers. So being able to talk to somebody, or the psychotherapist or a counselor, or able to even journal, can have a huge impact.
Can you explain that reparenting portion
Yeah.
a little bit more? I thought I understand, but I just want to hear it again.
That's absolutely. Thank you. So the repairing aspect of it comes down to the fact that you started to become the guide for your own inner self. Now you become it's essentially a decision that you take to better take care of your own self. The key thing being that you're more compassionate and that you're more understanding.
I recognize myself in these situations when that inner child kicks in or feels hurt again.
Right. You see that sometimes we don't even recognize the inner child aspect until we go through some sort of stressful, or sometimes, so that's something you will see. The triggers usually tells you where you need to heal, essentially.
I was actually shocked that more or less all 8 aspects of inner child was fitting me through during the course of my life. So some of them I have under control, but I wasn't aware that is all inner child issues. So
It can be because one of the things is that it says that over 80 to 90% of your behavior is governed by our subconscious up
Yeah.
until the point that you starting to become aware, right? Or become more conscious.
That's the key point, becoming
Right.
aware. And
That's
that's
right.
when you can start unlearning and learning new habits. Yeah.
That's
But
the whole,
it's
that's
difficult.
my goal. Yeah,
Yeah, it's very difficult.
I
Mhm.
know it can be.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. I think Brandy.
I had a question on this slide about validation because I hear a lot about not needing or
Yeah.
people not needing external validation. And I understand that as your self-confidence should come from within.
Right.
But I want to understand the difference between validation and acceptance. So I
Right.
don't need other people to tell me if I'm a good person, but I still want to feel safe within a group of people. They accept me for who I am. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between that need for self-love versus feeling accepted in a group?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually one of the things that when I'm doing counseling for my clients, is that one of the first things that we bring up is that how to validate yourself, even when other people are not there to accept you or validate your emotions or what you're going through. So, what I really wanted to get at here is that regardless of whether, usually it's to do with we making some sort of a mistake, or we missed out on something, or we didn't do something right? So rather than being the agent who criticizes you for doing the wrong thing, you actually say, you know what, it's okay. We make mistakes. We sometimes we go through guilt. We make the wrong action. So it's almost an internal state of, I guess it would be acceptance, but it goes that extra step where you started to become more kinder to you, even though you could have done it better in the past. But at that time, you did what your best with what you know. So the validation aspect for me comes from helping people recognizing, hey, be kinder to yourself, even if you feel like you feel guilty about something or done things wrong. And then that can actually influence how your subconscious mind back again learns to validate you when you're going through the problems. Because when we have a hard time validating our own selves, when we're going through trouble and difficulty, we tend to seek it out from externally, looking for that acceptance outside of us. But when we are at a somewhat point, hey, it doesn't matter what other people, whether they accept us or criticize us, it's still, I'm there for myself, even though what I do wrong. That's the ideal state. I'm not saying it's easy to get there, but it can essentially help you with the healing process, because now that inner voice of needing that acceptance from outside is no longer needed. That self-validation, self-compassion is what is more valued and will heal you a little bit better. So what is really healing? So inner child feels safe enough to relax. I think that's the biggest one to understand, is that your inner child can now relax and be at peace, right? And then you will see that your perception, right? Once you started to become more coming closer to your healed state or coming closer to healing, your perception all tend to become more loving of yourself and others, whether it's somebody who hurt you or whether you're of yourself or about the world. So you will see that your perception overall become more loving as well. And then another key thing is that the emotional reactions, what we consider triggers, right? We talk about how triggers are the ones that shows the level of woundedness we have, right? So the emotional reaction of the triggers will become information. They won't be threats to you. They won't be putting you on a data hijacked type of state anymore. You will just say, hey, I can feel it. I can sense this. I can say, hey, not useful for me to react to that way anymore. Right? So that's essentially the idea. And then one of the main things is that also it's aspect of allowing the nervous system to rest and calm down. Because you will see that a lot of people have issues because they don't know how to calm down their nervous system. So that's essentially how the North Star look like. So we'll talk about the tools as well. So one of the first tools, right, I would say is, in terms of when you're beginning, if you're whether in the beginning of your healing journey or you just started to get to know about this stuff, I will tell you one of the most valuable tools that helped me is to understand how to wrap my own mind across my mind, right? So understanding these three levels of the mind, the way, again, I'm not saying this is how the mind is set up necessarily, but it is a valuable model for you to process and how to understand things and how to learn things in the future, right? So you can see that according to this model, there's three levels of the mind. right? So there's the conscious mind, which is developing as we are speaking, as you're taking courses, learning about things. And as you become more and more aware, you will start to see the more patterns in your subconscious mind, right? Your beliefs, your romantic thinking, your emotions, your memories, your reactive and protective nature of your subconscious mind. And you also notice that the subconscious mind tend to be very repetitive. So when you have to train something, you also have to be repetitive as well, right? So sometimes you'll say, hey, coming to sessions like this once might be good, but if you can do it repeatedly, learn the right stuff repeatedly, that's where you really make the difference to the subconscious mind or the nervous system or inner child, right? So it's an important to understand having the setup of the mind actually helped me make sense of what I needed to do and where the issue was coming from. So perfect. Let's see. And in terms of the superconscious mind, I'm not going to focus too much on that, but you understand there is a capability within your mind that you can essentially ask for help and get guidance from as well. But key thing to understand the nature of the subconscious mind and the conscious mind, and then know that you're essentially working within your subconscious to heal yourself essentially. There's another key model that you will see that when you're trying to now, you'll see that a lot of our thoughts and beliefs tend to have a huge effect on our emotions and our actions and results, right? So I created this model called the T-bear model, which essentially predicts if you were to have these type of thoughts, it can lead to these type of beliefs or these type of emotions or actions or results, right? So understand that much of our thinking, right, is tend to be automatic, and especially our thinking tend to be automatic, our emotions tend to be automatic, right? And they are usually present in conditions like anxiety, but the key understanding here to understand that they are influenced by our past, our family, our friends, our parents, school, and culture, right? So once you start to understand how this model works, right, started to see, hey, your thoughts and belief have an influence on emotions, you can picking and choosing what be thoughts and beliefs that you want to keep for yourself and what you need to change, right? So changing is essentially you're learning new things, new skills, new abilities, new way to perceive things, right? So understand the subconscious mind and understand that through repeated learning and repeatedly changing your beliefs and your thoughts, you're actually changing your emotions and your actions and your reality and whether you heal yourself or not. So that you will see that when it comes to our triggers or our problem areas usually comes as anxiety and triggers, right? Usually you want to pay attention to, especially when you're experiencing anxiety or any triggers, what are the thoughts or beliefs that is now running in your mind? This is a good time to believe it. Usually this is the time where you started to have a lot of negative self-criticism, or you abandon yourself or become hard on yourself unnecessarily during this time. This is the time actually to become more compassionate. But first, more than even the compassion aspect of it, learn to become more aware of this aspect exists, that how your mind essentially divided into these 5 things. It is tough. One of the things that you see that sometimes keeping a journal can be quite useful. I know this is one of the major things that has been quite valuable for me, and also something I recommend to my client is sometimes we just want to be heard and seen. And if you don't have access to a therapist or a coach or counselor, right, I think the best place you can get that aspect out is through a journal. Start journaling what you're truly feeling inside, or speak to a voiceover. But having that somebody to speak to and finding somebody is very valuable. That's why people do seek out counseling a lot more people than before, right? A lot of people, when I'm coaching executives that I'm working with, the level of self-criticism they have is too much, to the point that they're hurting themselves. It's causing issues like anger, anxiety, sadness, and guilt. And again, this is why something I truly wish I learned early in my life. I feel like a lot of the problems I would have had with like burnout and anxiety, those things could have been prevented. Also, again, with self-criticism, do a little bit of research on your own on Google, see how effects of self-criticism on yourself and what can you do about it instead, right? So self-talk, but it can as a protective mechanism in right. It did, in fact. So you're continually overwatching yourself to see if you're making and correcting. But the key to it is to start kind of watching, now you're thinking about what are the nature of the con. Are they positive? Are they helping you? Because if you knew self-critical thinking is not helping you, why would you continue to practice it, especially if it's affecting your mental health, right? So a lot of people actually don't know that self has a huge impact in terms of overall your level of well-being, right? We cannot stop other people from criticizing, but at least we can stop ourselves from criticizing. But again, very valuable thing for you to remember. So observe how you talk to yourself, and again, remember that stress can increase negative self and self-criticism as well. So keep an eye on that, and then make a decision essentially to whether self-criticism is it going to helping you? Is it going to serve you in a way that is valuable? Okay. Essentially, the other side of the self-criticism, which is what instead practice self-compassion, right? Compassion, I would say, foundation of healing. You cannot expect compassion from outside of yourself, either from family or friends or anyone else. But starting point is that can you be compassionate to your own childhood experiences, the challenges you then went through, the difficulties you face, right? So a lot of people think being themselves will help them prevent problems in their life. They will get things done. But what key to understand is that being kind and actually towards yourself is the right way to do it, right? And again, it's not just a good idea. I'm saying it's not because it's a good idea. It's actually scientifically proven, evidence-based way to do that, right? So it could look like kind on yourself, especially during stressful situations, because that's usually when the problems become a problem, right? When you started to have a problem, and also talking to yourself with judging, right? So taking responsibility without self-punishment is actually what really goes far, because you usually during stressful, when you're feeling guilty, self-punishment can be the way what we use, because that's what probably we learned when we were younger, right? And also not abandoning yourself during stress or during okay, so that's, and also like how does essentially it looks, right? So say I made a mistake, and instead of saying I'm so careless, why can't I get anything right, instead of saying that this is a stressful moment, mistakes happen under pressure, I can slow down and take one step calmly, right? So that the mentality of just you being there for your own self is really what this aspect of compassion is that, remember, it usually becomes a during stress. And then also and feeling behind. Many people behind in their life, right? So that's negative self-talk, right? Or saying I'm falling behind everyone else. I should be able to handle this by now. I'm feeling because lots of being asked of me. Anyone in situation would feel this way. So recognize that your unique speed of learning and growing. So allow that and be there for that. And the anxiety is showing up unexpectedly. This anxiety is ridiculous, something wrong with me. You can reframe it saying, my nervous system is activated now, trying to protect me. I can meet this moment with kindness, right? So surrounding yourself towards more compassionate, more gentler way of you perceiving yourself and taking care of yourself becomes essentially the right approach to handle it, right? So these are essentially key principles that I would recommend for anyone to actually practice. Okay.